All right, this is where agents start getting a lot more interesting, a lot more fun, and a little bit more on the crazy side. So, what we're going to be doing in this section is we're going to be introducing the concept of a looping. So, looping is what kind of takes our agent from something that's a little bit more turn based, something that you kind of, up to this point, we've sort of been inputting a query, the agent's calling a function, doing something, maybe using its memory to help out with that, and then it's getting back to us, and we kind of go back and forth. What we're going to be introducing with looping is a little bit more on the autonomous agent side of things. So this is going to allow the model, the LLM and the agent that we build and all the tools and the memory stuff that we kind of combine to form that agent, it's going to allow it to run recursively in a loop. Okay. So without us kind of needing to talk back and forth with it, it's going to sort of be able to loop and plan and do all of kind of the iteration that you would see a human do in the real world, right? Like if you give somebody, send somebody on your teammate a Slack message and say, hey, I need this done, right? They're going to basically go through a loop with all of their various skills and all the information that they have access to. And they're going to go in a loop until that task is done. And then they're going to get back to you. And what we're going to be doing in the looping section is we're going to be trying to recreate that kind of human behavior, but in agent form. So this is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to start by looking at this heavily color-coded diagram here, and then we're actually going to jump into this example here. We're going to go ahead and you know what? Let's just have you do a git pull origin main here just to make sure that you have the latest and greatest code. So you want to go over to the looping section. We actually are going to be looking at this example of a travel planner agent in this section. So we're going to cover the looping and the planning stuff, and then once we do that, we're going to start getting into some of the more real world applications where we actually build an agent from scratch. So that will be in the next section where we build the agent actually from scratch. So we'll actually get more into writing the code instead of just learning conceptual things and looking at existing code. And then we'll be implementing that with a actual user interface, and we'll be using an example very similar to this one. So this hopefully between what we go over here in the diagram and what we review here in the code on this travel planner.ts file, this should hopefully really start to get all of these pieces really meshing together in your brain. Obviously, there's a lot of moving parts with agents, so we just want to kind of try and gradually work our way up to more complex examples here. And so this is going to be fun because it's going to take everything that we've done and slap looping on the top of it, and you'll get to see kind of a little bit more of the interesting use cases and how you can kind of, if you really use your imagination and get creative with some of the stuff, you can actually build pretty incredible agents already, which is super cool. So that being said, let's actually dive into this diagram here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at kind of all of the parts that we've looked at up to this point, kind of the core LLM, all the tool stuff, the memory stuff, and how that comes to form an agent. And then up to this point, we've kind of been doing turn-based messages here to interact with that agent. And then we're going to be introducing the loop here. So let's go ahead and just look at this diagram just to kind of refresh everyone's memory and make sure that we are all on the same page with how everything comes together here. All right. So the very core building block that we're working with here, right, is we're trying to work up to an agent, right? And if we loosely define an agent as an LLM plus tools plus memory plus what we'll introduce here, which is looping, right, we kind of have an agent. So the very core of that is going to be the LLM stuff, which you're going to see here in purple here in the middle. Okay, so the LLM, and you really can kind of put all three of these in one. I separated them just to make things a little bit more clear, right? But at the very core, it starts with the model, right? You have to pick what model do you want powering your agent, right? So you got to select your model. You've got to select the settings, right? So this is going to be things like, some of the control stuff that you have over things like temperature, right? So it's like how creative or how deterministic do you want the agent to be? Which that's all. Well, we won't get too deep into some of those parameters, but it's things like max token output, right? Do you want to set a limit on how many tokens the agent should be allowed to output, right? They can help you do things like control your costs. And then, of course, there's things like how many tokens do you want it to be able to input, right? How big do you want your context window? Which, again, this affects things like, longer context window is going to allow you to use more memory here, but that's going to make your cost go up. It might make the agent a little slower. Things like that, right? And then lastly, it's that system prompt, right? It's that series of instructions that you give your agent to kind of define what it is and how it should behave, and get into things like few shot prompting examples, right? Based on memory, right? We've kind of gone over this in some of the prior sections. But that's kind of all the things that come together to form the LLM that you want to use to power your agent. The red here on the right, this is kind of the memory aspect here that we went into. So this can be anything from short-term memory, which we're kind of going to refer to short-term memory like we have in the past, which is more or less sort of your system prompt plus your messages, right? It's everything that you're building into that context window, right? And kind of, again, to go back to that computer analogy, it's sort of the RAM. It's the memory that it has direct access to without needing to go do a retrieval step. And all the retrieval side of things, right? Whether that's fetching information via a database, right? We've covered this example with the customer support agent, right? If you need to go refer to a user, grab that user information, inject that into the memory, and then use that as part of a system prompt or as part of a message, right? You can go grab from that long-term storage with retrieval principles, and that stands for APIs as well, right? So you need to do something like you need to go get, the weather on a specific day, and maybe you have access to some products weather API, and you can go do that, right? You can use that to get the memory as well. So we've kind of talked about that. And then this last example, of course, with the retrieval stuff starts to tie into tools, right? Because typically, the way that you're actually going to go access that memory is with some sort of a retrieval tool. Again, we've kind of ran the examples on this in the past, but so that's going to be all the stuff that you see here in green, right? You're going to use, you're going to give your agent access to a bunch of different tools in the form of function calling, and that's going to help the agent know what it is able to do, right? What actions can it actually take besides just generating the text, right? This is how we get the agent to actually do things in the real world. What you'll see here is, and we're going to introduce sort of this concept in the looping section here, is you'll see that this tool number 1, we're actually adding 3 additional tools here, which is subtools. And the principle, kind of the core idea that you see demonstrated in this diagram here is actually what the main focus is going to be of this lesson. It's going to be, how do we take this idea here of a tool with subtools and apply this to the looping principle, okay? So really quick before we actually get in the code and we start kind of trying to match our code up to this diagram here, let's actually take a look at the diagram here for messages. So like I said at the start here, what we've pretty much been doing up to this point is we've basically been doing a turn-based agent interaction here, which isn't autonomous, which is still fine, right? You can do a ton of really cool things, right? A lot of like customer support agents are powered this way, right? The user gives a message, the AI calls a function, you go run the code for that function, gives you the response back, and then the AI generates an answer, and then you kind of, you keep interacting with it depending on what you need. But what we're going to be introducing here is the idea of a tool that has access to tools, and we're basically going to be using the travel agent as an example of this. And so what's going to happen here is, if hypothetically at the function calling state, okay, so say I need a vacation planned to New York City or something, okay, that's going to recognize, hey, I need this tool 1 called, and tool 1 is going to have access to a bunch of what we're going to refer to as subtools, which are just the same as normal tools. It's just these are only going to be added to your agent conditionally based on if tool 1 was called. And if you're starting to feel a little bit lost here, don't worry. Obviously, this diagram is a little bit abstract. We're going to be getting into the actual code, and we'll map that code to this diagram here, and things will start to click. But the point is that once, for example, tool 1 gets called, this loop is going to be able to kind of iteratively go through. And so all of these AI messages here with the function calls, these function calls are all going to correspond to the subtools, and that is going to continue to loop, right? You can see we have this little loop arrow here, and that's going to loop until a certain condition is met, right? Because in order to exit a loop, you need to have some sort of a check to tell when the agent should actually exit the loop. So we're going to be getting into how we actually build those conditions, some tricks that you can use to get the model to check if conditions are met and things like that. So that being said, let's actually get away from this abstract diagram here and actually into real stuff. So let me just show you at the top here this travel planner actually working before we actually even look into the code. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that relative path. We're going to go TSX, paste that path in, and this is going to run the AI travel planner, okay? So again, we have kind of a CLI style program right here in the terminal, and what we're going to do is we're just going to say hi, okay? And what you'll notice here, and we're getting a bunch of extra logs, so feel free to customize, if you think this is over logging anything, feel free to get rid of that. But you'll see we say hi, it sends a request to OpenAI, the AI responds to us. Okay, so at this point in the diagram, right, we're right here. Our agent is already built. We're interacting with it, right? This is what the hi message is. And the AI message is actually not calling a function, okay? So it's not going to have to refer to any tool message. We're just going right to this AI message, right? We're basically skipping these two because no function is called, okay? And in this case, the AI, based on how the agent is built, is saying, hello, I'm here to assist you to plan your trip. Could you please provide me with the destination you'd like to visit, your budget in USD, and how many days you plan to stay? So I'm going to say I'm going to London. We'll say I have a budget of $1.8 thousand and I'm going for 5 days. We're going to go ahead and hit return, and you're going to see a bunch of things happening here. So the first thing you're going to see, okay, again, sending a request to OpenAI, you're going to see that we're calling the plan trip function, and then it's executing plan trip with these arguments, okay? So what this is this is a function call, okay? So we have a function call called plan trip. We'll show you this in the code in just a sec. We're gonna run through this again while I actually show you the code. I just kind of want to run at a high level kind of through the entire thing just to kind of set the stage here. And you can see it's doing London, UK, budget $1,800, and then trip length of 5 days, okay? And what you'll see here is it's going through iteratively a bunch of steps, and we have a maximum number of steps set at 10, and I'll talk more in just a little bit about why that's important. But you can see in this first iteration here, we're getting, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 tools being called, okay? So let's jump back to the diagram really quick and just recognize where we're at, okay? So I sent a new user message. This time, the AI did in fact make function calls, okay? In this case, it's calling all 4 of these functions here. Okay, so we're right here, and it's going to have to go call those tools, okay? It's going to use the function call to call the function code, okay? We've been using these terms throughout the entire course here. So that's kind of what the AI is going to do at this point. So you can see it's executing function get flights for London. These are the results, okay? It looks like it's calling the function get hotels with that argument again for London. These are all the hotels we could possibly be staying at. It's calling the get attractions function. Okay, so that's the third function here with a bunch of data that's being returned. And then it is calling the get restaurants function again with the same location here. And it's giving us all of this data. Okay, so those are the 4 functions that are being called. And you'll see here the AI, based on our user input and based on all of the returned information, based on all of the results from the function code, we're getting this itinerary here as a message, okay? And what's happening here is we're actually, after the itinerary is built, the AI is doing one more function call, and we're getting, we're calling the check budget. It looks like the total cost is $1,640, which is below our $1,800. That is going to pass as within the budget. It's going to grab the difference here, and then it's going to return true here. It's going to grab the budget here, and then it's going to return the itinerary as a message here. And you can see it also gives us that little cost breakdown. So we're doing a bunch of stuff here. You can see here, and this is where things get interesting, and this is where the loop comes into play. If you look at our logged conversation history, we actually don't have all of sort of those intermediate messages that we just saw running with the iteration steps being listed. So you can see we have the system message being passed in. That's just the system prompt. We have the initial hi message. Okay, we have the response to that. Then we have my message of specifying the parameters we're kind of working with. Okay, so I said I want to visit London. This is my budget, and here's how many days. And then you're seeing a single tool call. Okay, a single tool call, not the 4 tool calls. You're just seeing one, and you're just seeing this plan trip, okay? And this is our loop function, which we're going to get to in just a sec here. And then you'll see what we're doing is we're passing the result back from the plan trip, and sort of all of the information, all of the processing that was done for this plan trip is actually stored in a separate area so as not to kind of muck up our chat history and kind of make it unnecessarily long. This is where the loop is going to come into play. So Hopefully the stage is set at this point. Let's actually go look into the code at how all of these moving parts are kind of fitting together, and we'll actually explore how those iterative steps here are actually coming into play with this loop. Okay, so at the very top here, you'll see things are going to look pretty similar to what you've been seeing at this point, right? We're kind of initiating our OpenAI client. We're importing our environment variables to make sure our API key works. We're defining some types here. Okay, so you saw we had flights, hotels, attractions, and restaurants. Okay, so we're using kind of 4 data types. And then instead of actually hooking this up to a live database, what we've done here is we've just come up with some mock data for London and some mock data for Paris, just so that you can kind of play around with the tool with 2 different locations, just to kind of get a feel for how things worked. Okay, so we're not actually going to set up a database, just because I think that's a little bit overkill here. We're just going to be mocking that with the fake data. So you can see we have an array of flights here. Okay, so we have things like the departure location, arrival location, price, things like that, which we're not necessarily using all of those values, but this is just to kind of give you an idea of how real world data can be used with function calls, right? We have all this fake data for hotels, again, hotels for Paris and hotels for London, depending on which one you want to choose to play around here in this example playground here. Then we have a bunch of attractions and we have a bunch of restaurants. Okay, so that's kind of all of our fake data. And what we're going to do here is we're actually going to copy all of this, or we're going to duplicate this rather. And what we want to do here is basically map out in real time how our code is corresponding to this diagram, right? So in this case, we're basically not going to be working with an API, right? We're basically going to be pretending that we have a database here with all of the different information. So basically we're working with effectively 4 tables, right? So if I add a 4th one here, we'll draw this arrow here, just to kind of make things clear, right? So we have flights, we have hotels, we have flights, we have hotels, we have restaurants, and we have attractions. Okay, so again, all this isn't actually hooked up to a live database, but it's effectively our mock database, just to kind of keep things a little bit simple. So what's happening on the memory side of things is that anytime our agent needs to get access to any of this information, it's basically calling a retrieval function here, which if we go down just below, you'll see we have a list of 4 tools here. We have get flights, get hotels, get attractions, and get restaurants. Okay, so we have access to each one of those tools, and we also have a check budget tool, and then an is trip plan tool. So what we can do here is we can go over to our tools, and what you'll see here is that we have main tools. Okay, so this is our main high level tool. So this is going to be plan trip. This is going to be the plan trip function. We actually, in our main tools, only have 1 tool, so we can kind of get rid of those. But then here we have those 6 tools, right? We have get flights, okay, and that's going to correspond to our flights table here, which in this case is just a mock data of kind of fake flights in that array. We have get hotels, we have get restaurants, and then we have let's go ahead and add these 2 more squares here. Right there, we want get attractions. Let's see, get attractions, and then we have, we don't need the 0. We have check budget, and we have is trip planned. Okay, so this tool here, build trip, has access to all of these 6 subtools. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to explore how does the model know when to call this tool, and then how does this tool know how to access all of these 6 subtools. How do all of these come together? How do these play with the memory here that we're working with, and so on. But before we get to that, let's just finish filling out our diagram here. So in this case, we're actually going to be working with GPT-4o. So you'll notice this is different than the model that we've mostly been working with up to this point, which, and you'll see if we scroll down here, you'll see we're working with, where is it? GPT-4o here. That's our model here. We're working with 4o instead of 4 mini because as you start to get to more and more function calls and you're doing a little bit more complicated things, you need a little bit more of a powerful model, which we're going to be using in this case because, for example, when the AI actually goes and plans our budget, right? Sort of in the background, it's having to do some basic math and things like that, which are pretty much tasks that we need to actually work accurately, right? A travel agent that adds up a bunch of numbers incorrectly, which might happen on a less powerful model like GPT-4o Mini, that might break down and kind of ruin our entire agent. So in this case, we're going to want to access that more powerful model. So you may just for testing purposes want to actually make this GPT-4o Mini just so it's cheaper to test, which is totally fine. One of the ways that you can kind of think about building agents is like start with the less powerful model, see if you can get things working. And if it's having struggled, then maybe bump up the model. But in this case, I just kind of want to demonstrate the differences in kind of raw power of these models. So in this case, we're going to be working with GPT-4o. Our settings are going to be pretty much vanilla here. You'll see we're only passing in messages and tools. Theoretically, we could set temperature to be like 0.5 instead of its default as 1, which maybe we'll do that right here. And we'll just say temp is equal to 0.5 just so we can show one setting that's changed. And then our system prompt, you'll see we have in the conversation history here, we have one system message. Okay, again, that's going to be with the OpenAI API on a model like GPT-4o. That's going to be passed in like this, right? And this is our system prompt. We're saying you are a travel planner assistant, gather the destination budget and trip length. Okay, and that's why in the messages, why you saw, if we can scroll up here, there's, like I said, there's a lot of logs going on here. You can see the agent actually asked for all of these three pieces of data, right? It asked for the destination, asked for the budget, and asked for the trip length. And we define that in the system prompt because we have this plan trip function here. Okay, we have the plan trip function here that requires each one of those items, each one of those parameters as a required variable here for this function. Okay, and so we can't actually call this plan trip function with all of these sub functions here, all of these subtools until we have the information. Okay, so by putting that in the system prompt, you're sort of prompting the agent to be like, okay, you need to make sure that you get this information from the user. And then because you'll see here, we have this main tools array, which is just the plan trip, as you can see defined here in our diagram. We're passing that to the model here. And because it has access to those function calling schemas, right, it has access to those tool blueprints. Once we actually give the information needed, okay, so in this case, London, 1.58K in 5 days, each one of those three things is covered in our user message. The model's intelligent enough to realize, okay, I have that information. I can now call plan trip, which you see demonstrated here. So once plan trip is called, which is kind of where we're at here, we could even paste that. Actually, let's just unpaste that. I think you get it'll go beyond the range of our square here. Right at that point, we have our tools, we have our LLM, and we have our memory. And at that point, we have our agent completely built, right? So that's when the user message comes in. But now we need to talk about when does this loop actually get activated, okay? Which is kind of what we're talking about right here with this plan trip function and all of these subtools, right? Where does this loop get activated here with all of these subtools? Okay, and where that gets activated, as you'll see here in our code, this is basically what's happening, right? We're grabbing the user input, pushing that to our conversation history. We're sending that as a message here. Okay, we're passing the conversation history to the OpenAI API, right? We're using the chat completions API with GPT-4o, with our settings, with our functions passed in here, and we're getting a message back from the AI. Okay, so to follow this example, right, we're saying, hi, it's asking for the information. We give it the information, and at this point, it's realizing, okay, I can call a function. So what we do here is we're checking, okay, if message has a tool call. If there is an existing tool call, then what we want to do is we want to actually go handle that tool call, okay? So you can see here we have this execute function, which is going to pass the function name here. And if I go to that function down here, you'll see that one of the cases here in a switch statement, if you're not familiar with the switch statement programming, we're basically just checking if the value of this variable matches any of these things, okay, and each one of these just correspond to our function names. We want to execute that function. So in the case of this plan trip function here, okay, you can see executing planned function plan trip with args. These are the arguments here. So what we're doing in this case is we're checking, okay, we are in fact calling a function. The function that we're calling is plan trip. So let's actually run this piece of code. And what this is doing is passing the destination, the budget, and the trip length into this plan trip function. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're basically saying, okay, it looks like we do have a function call. It corresponds to this one. Let's actually go handle that use case. So let's go look in our code what the plan trip function actually does. So you can see here on line 591, we're on the plan trip function. Again, we have those three things as parameters that came back from the function call that the AI was asking us to provide in the chat. And here's what's happening. We're basically doing, and you can see we have a new message history that we're kind of working with, which we're calling the planning history. What we're doing is we're now kind of going off to the side and we're engaging in sort of a new autonomous message loop here that's separate from our main chat thread. Okay, so remember how we scrolled down all the way to the bottom here and we looked at the logs for our conversation history, and you noticed, okay, we only have kind of the core conversation history. We didn't have all of this stuff that was going on here with all of those different function calls and those different iterations and things like that, right? That's what this kind of side loop is doing. What we're doing is we're sending the message. So at this point, we're sending the message with the location, the budget, and our amount of days. It's recognizing that we need to call the plan trip function. And inside of the code for the plan trip function, we're going, okay, in this one, we're actually almost starting a new chat history here, which in this case corresponds to the planning history here. And you'll see we have a new system prompt. We kind of have a new base chat completion API that we're working here. We're seeing we're actually passing in different tools. So you'll notice that instead of passing in main tools, okay, and again, main tools was that single array, which is this singular plan trip function. We're actually passing in all 6 of these sub functions here that correspond to the functions that the agent has at this level, right? So inside of this loop, we actually can't call the plan trip function, right? We're basically inside of that function already. What we can call in this loop is any of these 6 functions here, which you saw demonstrated when the model called the get flights, get hotels, get restaurants, and get attractions, right? It got those pieces of mock data from the memory here, it retrieved those, and it allowed us to build the itinerary correctly. So at this point here, we're kind of off to the side and we're actually working in a new loop. So I mentioned that we set our max iterations to 10. And what I want to do right now is just talk for just a second here about why that number matters. So one of the things, and this is a very standard principle of programming in general, not just with agents, is if you have some sort of a recursive loop, which in this case, we're using what's called a while loop, which we're just saying while this condition is true, keep running all of the code that is inside of the corresponding brackets for that loop. What can happen is if you provide some sort of a condition that actually never can hit true, right? Or if that condition always is true, it's just going to keep running literally infinitely. So what you need to do is you need to be able to set some sort of condition that allows you to exit that loop. And what we're doing in this case is we're basically saying every time you call this response back from the AI, this is going to initiate a single iteration. So what you'll see at the bottom here is we do this iterations plus plus. And what this means is just at the end of the current iteration of the loop, we're going to add 1 to this number. Okay. So the way that this works in practice is you run this while loop the first time. Okay, and what's going to happen is it's going to say, okay, is 0 less than max iterations, right? Because we're starting with 0. That is true. So the code inside of here is going to run. And that's going to be our first iteration. And then what we do at the end of that iteration is we add 1 to this number. Okay, so the 0 becomes 1. And now what we're doing is we're running the while loop again. And we're saying, okay, 1 is less than max iterations. Okay, so we're going to run the loop again, right? And this is going to keep going and keep going and keep going until we get to the point where you check here. We get all the way up to 10, right? So this let iterations will get up to 10. And then when you go to while 10 is less than 10, right? 10 is not less than 10. So this is actually going to resolve to false, and it's not going to run the code inside of here. This is important, especially for agents, because you could, before you go to bed, you could run your agent and have it go do a task. And maybe you may accidentally kind of get it stuck inside of a while loop that's never going to evaluate to false, meaning that it's going to run forever. And then suddenly you wake up and it just keep trying, it's still trying to accomplish its task. Your API bill is like $600 or something crazy. And basically you never gave it the opportunity to exit. You never gave it the opportunity to stop. So one of the things that can be really helpful to do when you're building some sort of an autonomous agent that can actually engage in some sort of a loop is that you want to be able to provide some sort of a condition where it's like, okay, after it's been running for a while, whether this is turns, whether this is time, you want to kind of be able to build it in a way where if it doesn't accomplish the task after a certain amount of time or whatever, it's going to stop. Okay, which is what we're doing here. And this is a really important thing that you need to remember when you're building your own agents so that they don't just run forever, right? You need to basically build these hard stops where if things go wrong, if it gets stuck or whatever, it can stop. So that's the little lesson here with max iterations. So we just want to make sure that you understand that principle. You understand that anytime you engage in one of these loops, you just need to provide a hardcore limit so that at the end of the day, it doesn't get stuck forever. Okay, and that's meant to protect you on the building side of things. It's meant to prevent bad user experience. If you deploy an agent to a user, right? If you just have an infinite spinner while your agent's going and going and going, right? That's never going to help, right? Whereas if you have some sort of an app and you can kind of put, maybe in the bottom right, you can say, okay, this is iteration 3 out of 10. 5 seconds later, it goes like iteration 4 out of 10, right? On the user side of things, it's like very clear. Okay, my agent's going to keep running and running and running until it hits its limit. So I'm willing to wait for a second, let it do its thing, right? So it's just best practices, no matter how you kind of want to slice and dice it. That being said, let's actually look at what's being performed inside of this loop. Okay, so at this point, the core thread history, kind of what we're working with in here, is called the plan trip function, which has kind of got us off to working on the side in this loop. And so now we have access to this new chat history, which is planning history, with sort of this sub agent that has access to all of his plan trip tools. Okay, again, that's the tools that you see as defined right here. And now we're working through that loop. So what the agent's going to do is very similar to, and you're going to see this paradigm all over the place, right? Is if the message has tool calls, okay, so if the agent has decided to call a tool, it's going to push each one of those to the planning history here, and it's going to loop over all of those tool calls. So in the example that we already ran down here, right, we had the 4 tool calls. So in this case, we're going to loop through all of the available tool calls here. We're going to execute the function. So what we did in the example you saw, right, is we got the get flights, we got the get hotels, right? We got all of those getters here. And what that did was it called each one of those functions. It got access to that mock data, and it injected that into the chat history so that our AI could actually know what was going on. Once it finished running those, it added it pushed the planning history here. That got added to the chat history. Let's actually scroll up so you can kind of see this, okay? Because eventually what our plan trip function resolved with was this particular itinerary here, which is really nice. You can see it's within budget and all that good stuff. Because what happened, and this is where you want to get into some sort of a method where not only can your agent exit the loop when it hits its max number, right, whenever it hits whatever the limit is you set, but you typically want to provide some sort of a function call or something similar where your agent can actually check if its task is complete. So the way that we're handling it inside of this particular agent is, you see we have all these functions that are sort of the getters, but what we also have is we have this isTripPlanned function. So what's going to happen, and this is what happened in the example I showed you below, is the AI used those first 4 functions here to get access to all of the information that it could, okay, for the trip that I asked for, based on all the parameters it had access to. And what we're doing here is this particular function call is not this trip budget, the isTripPlanned is returning 2 things. So it's going to return a Boolean value of whether the trip is fully planned, and it's going to return a string, which is this final itinerary. So if we scroll all the way back here to the planning loop here that we've been working with, you'll notice that if the tool call is specifically that isTripPlanned function, and if the result includes that is planned variable here, and it's set to true. Okay, so basically if the result of that function call, if the result of the is tripped planned function call is true, it's going to mean that our itinerary is fully set. And if our itinerary is fully set, we're going to return. Okay, so we're going to return, which means that we're going to exit this while loop here. We're going to return the final itinerary. So what this is going to do is, even if we're only on iteration 3 or 4, anything less than 10, if we haven't hit our maximum limit here, it's still going to end the loop and it's going to return the final itinerary here. And what that's going to do is that's going to mean, okay, we have at this point the information that we wanted. The AI has gone through and it's kind of recursively called all the functions and kind of talked with itself, so to speak, to figure out what the itinerary needs to be. This arrow that points back here is going to push that final itinerary here as an AI message, and then the AI is going to correctly respond back to us. So let's kind of, now that we've gone over all of the moving parts here, and again, I know there's a lot of moving parts here. Again, agents can be a little bit overwhelming the first time you go through this. So if it even helps you kind of to write all of this from scratch, even using a different example, which I think is an awesome exercise that you should engage in. I think this is a really good way to kind of nail learning that, which we're going to be doing, by the way, in the next section. Okay, so we're actually going to write one of these things from scratch, which should hopefully kind of fuse those last remaining branches in your mind that need to be connected together. Actually doing this from scratch instead of looking at an existing example, right? I know this is, we're looking at almost 700 lines of code here. A little overwhelming, but let's actually just run through this manually here one more time, going through the diagram as we do it, now that we've kind of filled everything in, and kind of hopefully connect all the dots. So we're going to run our program here, and we're going to say, I want to go to London. We're going to say I have a $2.1 thousand budget, and I want to do a full 7-day trip here. Okay, so at this point, we've built the agent, right? We've given it access to that main function here, that main function, which in this case is just the plan trip function here. You could theoretically have a bunch of functions in here, of course, but we're just trying to simplify to that singular plan trip function so this doesn't get too crazy of an example, right? We've built the LLM, right? We've constructed that system prompt. We've picked a model. We've set any settings that are relevant here. And then based on all of those arrays of mock data here, we've kind of constructed its long-term memory that it has access to. And the way that it accesses all of these different mock arrays are based on all of those 4 getter functions here that are in this plan trip loop, right? So all of these are kind of like subtools. So at this point, we're going to send our first user message to this agent. And that user message is going to give the 3 parameters that are required to call plan trip. So what's going to happen is the model is going to see this information that I'm about to send it, and it's going to say, okay, these are the functions that I have access to. It looks like plan trip depends on those 3 variables, which I now have access to. Let's call that function. Okay, so let's just get to that point. Okay, so we're going to send that. You'll see that this is actually funny. So when you send messages to the AI, you'll see I said literally it's interpreting this value as $2.10 because I forgot that K, which is pretty funny. So we just add that K here. That's going to take care of the error. That's kind of a funny little anecdote here. So you'll see here, let's scroll up so that we don't jump immediately to the bottom here, right? We kind of want to go turn by turn here and make sure that you're following here. So what you can see here, like I said, it recognizes, okay, based on the tools I have access to, we have all the information we need to call plan trip with these 3 specific arguments, okay? So the first function call, okay, so we're now on step 2 here. We're on the AI message, which is a function call. What's happening is it's calling plan trip, okay? And remember, in our code, when we call plan trip, what we're actually doing, okay, so let's go, let's scroll down. We're keeping all of this in one file just to make things a little bit easier to follow for you. But what's happening here, right, is we're saying, okay, it looks like this message has a tool call. Okay, so if message.toolCalls is true, right, because we're getting this plan trip function call here, we're calling this execute function. This is going to check which function we're calling, which in this case is plan trip. which that means we need to actually call the plan trip function here with these three values. Okay, so you can see how each one of these values corresponds to destination, budget, and trip length, which are all being logged here. You can see planning trip to London, UK for 7 days with budget of $2,100, right? So you can see that's being logged right there. And at this point in the interaction with the agent, we actually have now gone from being in the kind of standard chat history here to having the agent actually run autonomously here inside of a loop, right? Because what we're doing here, right, we're constructing that new message history. Okay, so that's going to correspond to all of these messages here that are looping, and we're going to set the limit. Okay, so this thing can run for up to 10 steps. So if the model, and this is going to change, right? If you're the task that you give it super complex, maybe you need a lot higher of a bump here or whatever. In this case, our agents typically probably going to only need anywhere from like 2 to 5 turns. So setting a limit at 10 makes perfect sense in the context of this example. And so at this point, we're in the loop here. So what we're doing is we're passing this new system prompt in. We're passing those 6 subtools, okay, which are subtools of the plan trip function here, all 6 of those. We're passing those in here, and the model's using the information that's coming back from the results of the function code. Okay, so each one of these different functions here are grabbing the mock data that we have that we defined here. Okay, so at this point, the model is using the subtools here to get access to long-term memory. It's adding those into functions here. And what's happening is it's going through those loops. Okay, so it's going through those loops while it's using that isTripPlan function to check if the trip is planned. So say it goes through, 2 or 3 steps, and then it decides, okay, it's time to call isTripPlanned. Say isPlanned actually comes back as false, okay, whether that our itinerary isn't fully planned, maybe it's over budget or something like that. What's going to happen is that while loop is going to keep running, okay, and it's going to keep running up to those 10 turns. If the isPlanned is true, okay, so if the model deems, okay, based on all of the information here that I have in this looped chat history here, where I've kind of been going, okay, tool call to getting some data to checking, okay, it's false, I gotta go make some more function calls, get some more data, okay, now it's true. At that point, we're going to return the final itinerary here. Okay, so we're going to return it, which means we're going to exit our while loop. We're going to exit that loop. We're going to provide that result to the tool message here, and then that's going to generate us a result. So let's go ahead down here in the logs here and look at how that played out. Okay, so you can see we're on iteration 1 out of 10. The assistant decided to call for functions, which I'm probably assuming are going to be all of those getter functions, okay? So we're using those subtools to access our long-term memory. We're getting the flights, we're getting the hotels, we're getting the attractions here, and we're getting the restaurants, okay? So that single iteration basically went ahead and got all of those pieces of data, and then in iteration 2, which corresponds to a new call to the API, to the OpenAI model here, in this case GPT-4o, okay? In this case, we're on iteration 2, and it looks like we got back an itinerary. Okay, so it looks like it did in fact construct us a 7-day itinerary with the financial breakdown, and the model responded with a tool call. Okay, so in this case, it responded with the check budget here. It looks like it actually got the total cost back here, and it looks like it got a few more pieces of information about the budget here. So it's like kind of one more function call here. And then we're actually going to a third step, okay, which is that the model looks like it's calling one more function. In this case, it's checking the isTripPlanned. So my assumption, without actually being able to go inside of the model's brain and analyze why it actually decided to call this function, is that it looked like it needed to go fetch all of the data that it needed, okay, which was kind of step 1. And then it went to step 2, which was checking, okay, we've kind of started with this V1 version of our itinerary. Let's actually check if it's in budget. Again, that's our 5th function call that we had access to. Okay, so in the second step, it decided to check the budget. It looks like that was verified to be within budget is true. So my kind of hypothesis, right, our kind of assumption here is that the model went, okay, it looks like at this point, we have constructed an itinerary that actually fits the constraints of what the user asked for. So isTripPlanned here, we passed in the itinerary, and it gave back a final itinerary, and it looks like isPlanned corresponded to true. So in that third turn, what happened is this kind of exit opportunity here, sort of our exit condition resolved to true, which means we returned the final itinerary. You can see that final itinerary is right here. Okay, this kind of green text right here. That was the result of the isTripPlan function, which means that we're going to now exit that while loop. Okay, so we have basically had the agent recognize, okay, I accomplished what I needed to do with this plan trip function. I'm going to give that back to the main conversation history. That's going to get injected, and that is going to allow the AI to respond. And you can see it's literally just responding with that itinerary. Okay. So that's basically how looping works, which is a little bit tricky. Looping and recursion is always one of those tricky things that is kind of difficult when people are learning programming for the first time. So if you're feeling a little lost, that's like pretty normal. Figuring out how to get programs to exit in recursive functions is something that takes a little bit of practice. It's kind of something that's not a normal condition that you see, in your life all that much. So it's kind of like a little bit of a new way of thinking. Existing programmers are probably pretty familiar with applying that kind of principle to something like an agent. But again, this should hopefully start clicking more in the next section when we actually build another one of these entirely from scratch. But the point here is that you want to, if you want to get into use cases where you're building autonomous agents, which just means you're doing giving an agent access to things where it can kind of recursively loop through a task to try and solve a problem. In this case, right, the problem that we're trying to solve is we're trying to solve the problem of, based on some very basic user input, we want to kind of build them an entire travel itinerary for a trip that fits certain conditions and has access to certain pieces of information that's held in kind of long-term memory inside of sort of a mock database here. And we're basically checking, okay, don't actually exit this loop until you've fully planned that itinerary, right? That's essentially the loop and the condition that we're using. So hopefully this was helpful. Again, I think things will, if you're feeling, a little bit loose, I do think that a really good recommendation here is to kind of go try and implement what we did here from scratch. You can even kind of get simpler with some of the data types. I try to just kind of provide you something that looked a little bit like a production grade example here with sort of the London and the Paris example, so you can kind of do two queries, right? If I went in here instead and said, let's run our program again and said, please plan a trip to Paris, this time, maybe my budget is like 2.8K this time, and maybe I actually have 3 days, or I'm gonna really ball out for a weekend or whatever, right? You can try a bunch of things. The agent's going to be good enough so that you could say like, hey, maybe say you're afraid of heights, so you don't do the Eiffel Tower or something, right? The cool thing about the way this loop works here is that the agent's going to take all of that information that you've provided it up to the point before the loop, right? And it's going to use that to kind of work through that, okay? So you can try a bunch of different queries here. I do actually recommend you play around with this. You could say something like, hey, I really like museums. Maybe you say something like, hey, I actually don't want to spend any money on attractions, so it only grabs things that are like zero price, right? There's a bunch of different things that you can play around with here, right? You can even tweak these function calls to be slightly different. Say you want to add some more flights as examples that have a different departing location, right? Maybe you're flying from Chicago or something, and you want to say, plan a trip that's from Chicago instead of New York or something, right? There's a lot of different ways you can go with this, but the primary thing that I just really want to make sure that you understand here is understand loops, understand function calling, and understand kind of the concept of subtools, understand the idea of recursion. Okay, you want to understand the idea that you need both to give the AI opportunities to exit the loop when the task is done, which we demonstrated in this example with that isTripPlan function. And you also want to give loops and agents the ability to exit when it hits a certain limit, right? So you kind of get away from infinite loops. So if you feel like you're understanding those three things, right, at this point, we have those entire sections dedicated to tools and memory. So those should be pretty crystal clear at this point. But introducing those subtools and the loop concepts are what you really need to kind of walk away from this particular lesson understanding. So go ahead and try, those different exercises that I recommended. You may want to watch this like one more time on 2x speed or something just to kind of help things sink in one more time. But otherwise, let's go ahead and move on to actually building one of these things totally from scratch.